Most of us are members, but again, if you're visiting, outlines are on the two communion tables. And we're going to be looking tonight at Ezra, chapter 7 and 8. I didn't mark this down, but it'd be kind of appropriate just to kind of walk us into what we're going to be looking at tonight. If you've been in classes where we've been talking about going through the Old Testament and especially teaching the Old Testament, we've talked about three different levels, and tonight we're going to be doing primarily one of those, and that's why I'll mention these quickly. But I always like to use the example of Joseph because most of us know Joseph. And I always feel like, number one, you can go through, and I just use the term biographical personality life, and you can go through Genesis 37 through 50 and just say, what does this tell us about the life of Joseph? And tonight, Ezra has recorded details in his book in the early part that have happened up to 80 years earlier. And so tonight, we're going to enter kind of a biographical part of the book of Esther. It's a totally different thing, but it's kind of like when we're in the book of Acts and Luke says we. Then as soon as Luke starts saying we, then he's not just heard about this, he's going to be a part of that. And so there's two or three times where we have what are oftentimes called the we passages. So that's the first level. The second level is that we can look at what God is doing in terms of building a nation. 70 people go down into Egypt. He has told Abraham ahead of time they're going to be there 4 long generations, and a multitude of people develop, are born. And so, yes, here is the individual, but then God is also working in terms of the things having to do with building the nation and his plans. And then the third level is that you can come back and just look at God. And I love to do that because of all of these, we probably don't do that one as much as the others. But tonight we're just going to look at a person, and I just want to say something very specifically and very clearly. We're going to look at one thing about 3 different times concerning Ezra, and it has to do with his preparation, and it's specifically going to be to teach. And I don't want anybody to sit here to sit and think, well, I don't teach a ladies' class. I don't teach an auditorium class. And I chose not to bring it and I'll kind of explain this. My family read, and the older generation had dozens of these old poems memorized. And there's a poem that says, I would rather see a sermon than hear one any day, for the eye is a better pupil than the ear, and it goes on to talk about that. And what I want us to be looking at individually as we go through this tonight is that in each one of our lives, there are some people, and this is the expression I like to use, who are going to read you like a book, but they may never be reading the Bible. David, how many people are in the Walmart store where you work on a given shift? 30? 20, 30? And you just stop and think, there's a whole group of people that are going to get to know him, they'll know things about him, and we don't always just teach by standing up and doing this. We teach by our manner and by our example. When we lived in Campbelltown, outer part of Sydney, for 8 years, we had wonderful neighbors for 7 years. Never did come. We invited them. We had visitors day every quarter. We had special stuff, and they were very friendly, very nice. But they were like this when it came to God. And one Sunday, we're going to be going out of town, and I've been busy on Saturday, and I had to get some things watered, and I'm mowing the yard, and I'm just about finished. Honest truth, I'd already laid my clothes out on the bed because I'm going to drop out of my work clothes, slip into these, and we're going to go out the door. And I'm just about finished, and here's this shadow right next to me by the lawnmower. And Graham says, is everything okay? And I'm thinking, well, okay, and that, yes, I'm physically able to do a lawnmower. And then here it came. He said, you're usually gone by now. And he said, I go down in the morning and I get fresh rolls in the newspaper, and our bedroom's right there. And he said, we have a cup of tea and we check, and you're supposed to be gone because you're normally gone by now. And so Pam sent me over to see if everything's okay because you should be at church by now. Here's the people who never came, invited multiple times. We lived next door to them. And Sheila overheard her say one day, she said, I have totally changed my opinion about Americans since I've been living next door and listening to how she talks to her kids over the fence. Did you get that? Was she teaching a Bible class? Was she standing up here, using a microphone? No, but the non-Christian neighbors are listening over the fence. And give them a break. Dallas and the Dukes of Hazzards are the two major TV programs while we're living there. So if you don't know any Americans, if you do some kind of hybrid between JR and the Dukes of Hazzards, then that was kind of the stereotype of what Americans were like. And fair enough, if that's the only thing you knew about them, you'd kind of feel like that too. But we were there for 7 years, and they got to become dear, dear friends. And what am I saying? We're outside talking to our kids and what's taking place. They're listening, they're learning, they're observing. And so there's going to be 3 things that Ezra does that will be a part of his public teaching. But what I want all of us to do before we leave tonight, just to stop and think, in the circle where you live, you have the potential to teach both by the way you live and also by your lips. And so when we come to the final application tonight, let's be prepared to be thinking, okay, where I live, my circle, my influence, here are 3 things that can be helpful for us to consider. So Ezra's return is at least 6 decades after the completion of the temple. And Ezra's going to make very specific preparation that God is going to use to call him to do some very specific things. So earlier in the book of Ezra, and this is chapter 2, verse 64, the first group, and we'll use the word exiles, meaning these are people carried into captivity by the Babylonians. When the handwriting on the wall happens in 539, the kingdom becomes Persian, the Persians take over. Within 3 years, they start sending people back. And this is a fairly sizable group. The first group of exiles is going to number 42,360. But by the time that Ezra gets there, they have been home for nearly 80 years. So let that just kind of sink in. Here are people who have been able to come back. The city's been completely destroyed, and you just can hardly imagine the difficulty and the crisis and trying to make a living and trying to get established and all these things. And we noticed this last week, and I just gave these simple dates. 536, the first exiles return. Then it takes 16, they get the temple started, they build the foundation, but it takes them 16 years, so the temple will finally be built in 520. And there's a number of things, but let me just do the 3 big ones. When the temple's finally built, and yes, they had an altar, but when the temple's finally built, then they can really kind of officially have the Passover. And these are easy to remember. The 3 references to the major feast are in chapter 23 of the 2nd and the 3rd book. So Exodus, 2nd book, 23. Leviticus, 3rd book, 23. First feast is Passover. And you're to stop. There's a whole ceremony that happens. There's the week of unleavened bread. But you are to stop and remember what it was like when God brought the people out of the wilderness. And the blood was then placed on the doors in those old days. And remember that. The second one is going to be 50 days later, the Feast of Pentecost. And this is a celebration of the harvest. The barley has come in, the wheat has come in. And then in October, it's kind of like our state fair type thing. And I always think of kind of like the Jewish Thanksgiving, is the Feast of Booths and Shelters, Tabernacles. and they literally built shelters and they camped out once all the crops had been done in the fall. And so once the temple's finally built, then we have the potential to worship on a whole different level than we had before. So this is going to be our key date for tonight. Ezra himself is going to return in 458. And so just look at this. The first group comes back in 536. It's going to take them 20 years to build the temple. And so here we are, nearly 80 years after the first group have come back. And then here is going to come Ezra the scribe, and we'll look at this. Lord willing, in a couple of weeks, then Nehemiah is also going to come, and he's going to come in 444. So it's a few years after Ezra. And then at a point in time, the two of those are going to join together. And I went ahead and just put this. Most people place the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, right toward the very end. And again, there are reforms that are needed, and God's people are being very lax on some things. And this is just kind of ironic. The clearest statement on marriage being a covenant is in Malachi chapter 2, and you have broken the covenant with the wife of your youth. And the very, very end, the last word is, remember the law of my servant Moses, and I'm going to send Elijah the prophet. So because of the dating in Ezra, and people have been able to check the calendars and things, then Ezra is going to begin his journey on April the 8th, 458. And it's going to take them 4 months to get home. And they will arrive on August the 4th, 458. I haven't projected a map, but the direct route through the desert was roughly 500 miles, but even armies didn't do that. Very seldom, you're thinking more like camels and nomads to even attempt, but you imagine trying to do a 500-mile journey through a desert. So then they would go up the Euphrates to have provisions and water and stuff, and then come back down, much like Abraham had. And so it's going to be a 900-mile journey. And so they're going to complete this initial journey that's going to take 4 months. Within the group that come with Ezra are only going to be about 2,000. And a group of people volunteer. Artaxerxes is going to say anybody that wants to go can go. But we're going to have roughly about 2,000, and then that's what we mentioned. This is going to be a 900-mile journey that they'll be traveling through the summer. It's going to take them approximately 4 months before they get home. So we get some very personal details about Ezra, and this is the first one. He is a Levite, so he's from the tribe of Levi, the priestly family, but he's not just in the family of Levi. He actually is a descendant of the high priest Aaron. So we're going to be using the word a lot, a scribe, and a scribe is going to be very much like a rabbi in the New Testament. So if you think of the term rabbi, someone who was a teacher in the New Testament, then a scribe in our Old Testament is someone he's a student, he has studied, he obviously would be a very qualified teacher in a very specific context. So he will be both a scribe, and we'll see this in a little bit. He is sent specifically to Jerusalem to teach God's people the law. And Lord willing, we'll read this in just a little bit. Of all things, the king of Persia sends him. There would be any number of scribes in Israel, and for whatever reason, Ezra is both kind of known and selected. And this is one of the things we're going to keep looking at. It was the preparation that he had put in years earlier that is going to qualify him to be able to do this. And so he's going to make this journey. And you'll see in Ezra chapter 7 and verse 1, it's during the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And so you read through this very first part of chapter 7, and like I said, by the time you get finished, there's the son of, and then the last two are the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the chief priest. Now, I want to try to do this as simply as possible. All Levites are priests, but not all priests are Levites. So everyone who's a priest is from the tribe of Levi, but there's a whole group of other people who are Levites, and they're not priests. Simplest way for me to explain this is everybody in Oklahoma City lives in Oklahoma, but not everybody who lives in Oklahoma lives in Oklahoma City. See what I'm trying to say? And so if you are a priest, you are going to be a smaller part. Everyone who's a priest is from the tribe of Levi, but there are another group of people just called Levites, and they often come and they help with different services, especially the sacrifices and the other things. And so this is something very specific about his background and his heritage. And so here is going to be, and I don't know how many greats you're going to be, great-great-great-grandson of Aaron, who's going to be Moses' brother. So those are two very specific things. He is going to be a rabbi, a scribe, someone who's studied, but he also is going to come very specifically from a priestly family. When you read Ezra 7 and 6, he was a scribe, and look at this interesting term, skilled in the law of Moses that the Lord, the God of Israel, had given, and the king granted him all that he asked, and we're going to hear this refrain over and over, the hand of the Lord his God was on him. You know, different people are skilled at different things. One of the things I so thoroughly enjoyed, and we just physically can't do this, but Daryl Davis's dad, James Davis, is just a superb outdoorsman. Grew up in Arkansas, large family. Dad had a bad back, and he figured out, probably about the time he was 8 or 9, that if he would catch either crickets or grasshoppers or whatever and catch some fish, they would have some protein with their beans and cornbread. And so he just became an avid outdoorsman and fisherman. And we fished in tubes with waders on, and James's vest was about 40 pounds. He could fix anything in his rod and reel in the tube out in the water without ever having to go back. And if you put a bucket about 20 yards about this big, he could hit it 9 times out of 10. It was just amazing to watch. So he was just really skilled at that. Well, do you remember in the New Testament, we're going to talk about the importance of rightly dividing the word of truth? And so Ezra is that person because, again, of his preparation and his study, he is skilled in that. We're going to say it this way as we go through. He not only knows what it says, but he has made a very diligent attempt to live it. And so what he has read has become a part of his life, and he has committed and dedicated himself to do this. So that was the term under Roman numeral 2, preparation to be involved in teaching and leading. And when you look at Ezra 7 and verse 7 and you go through, then here's a list of the people who are going back, and we're going to hear the refrain, the good hand of the Lord was with them. And that's one of the things that we'll discuss and we'll talk about here in just a second. Here's our key verse tonight. And I mentioned this at the very first night. My class on Ezra and Nehemiah, and as much as I enjoyed many of my classes at Oklahoma Christian, my favorite Bible class was Ezra and Nehemiah. Took it in the summer, and summer's so different on a college campus. Bill Jones just worked through a lot of things, and of all the classes I thoroughly enjoyed, Ezra and Nehemiah was my favorite one. And in the middle of that class, as we talked about it, Brother Jones said, and of course, we were just a group of guys that summer, he said, guys, he said, if you really want to be effective in ministry, this may be one of the most important verses in the Bible for you, not just to hear, but to know. And these are these 3 things, and we're going to work with these and come back with them. Ezra set his heart to study the law of the Lord. Number 2, to do it. And then what's the third one? To teach it. And we're going to come back and talk about that in a little bit, but let me just mention this. Our family, we're deeply involved in different kinds of sports. Dad's family got up at 4:30 every morning, and they milked all the cows, did all the chores, opened a country store, had the breakfast dishes in the sink before the sun came up every morning. Dad slacked off. We didn't get up till 5:30 or 6, so he let us sleep in. And there were a lot of mornings my dad hit the ground at 3:30 and just trotted all day. He just loved to be out. Well, we came from an athletic family. We're in the 7th grade. We go down to Mangum to play 7th grade basketball, and we do a clinic on everything you can possibly do wrong in one night, in one game. We traveled. We threw the ball out of bounds. It was embarrassing. When your mothers are embarrassed, it's a bad night. It was horrible. We got beat 31-13, and they actually scored 2 points for us. It was embarrassing. And we were all looking down, and Coach came in and he said, if we had one person, and he went through the list, who didn't travel, who didn't throw the ball out of bounds, who didn't all this stuff, he said, we would just leave him on the other end and let him play offense, and we would do better than we did tonight. And then he walked out the door. And Kelly, I thought, you are never going to be able to say that again. And so nearly every night when I came home, on came the yard light on the edge of the wheat field, and I would shoot 15 or 20 minutes. 6 inches of snow, you get out the aluminum scoop, and you do the side that the wind's on, and you shoot till one hand gets cold, and then you put a glove on and you shoot with the other one. I was a walk-on at Oklahoma Christian for 4 years. Translated, wasn't tall enough, big enough, fast enough to get a scholarship, but you give me a pair of tennis shoes, and I'll be at every practice for 4 years. Until we got married, I slept every night with a basketball. If you wake up, you can feel the seams, and in your mind, make 10 free throws in a row before you go back to sleep. Getting married and trading Sheila for basketball is one of the best trades I've ever made in my life. That was really good. But that was something I was just really focused on doing. In my hands, thinking about it, working with it. And very few people, well, let me say it this way. One of my teachers said, the best teachers are the best students. And people who really don't like to study are typically not going to be people who teach. And so here's something he set his heart, and he's going to be very specific. He's going to be very intentional. He's going to be very focused. And in each of our lives, in one way or another, we have the capacity to grow in our case, our Christ-likeness, to grow in our example, to grow in our maturity. And in doing that, we will have the opportunity also to teach in some different ways. So when you come to verse 11 of chapter 7, he gave to Ezra, and here comes the terms, the priest, the scribe, and he is a man learned in matters of the commandments of God. So here's this job description, and this is what's kind of ironic to me. This comes from the king of Persia. And you start reading in chapter 7 and verse 12, and he's Ezra the priest, and the king calls him the scribe of the law of God of heaven. And here's the decree. Anyone who wants to go back to Jerusalem can do that. They freely will do that. And then here's the contrast. The hand of God is working on one side, and then God's going to be putting physical things in their hands. This is one of my favorite lessons, and Lord willing, at some point I may do it here. But how did the Exodus, I'm back with Moses for a second. How did the Exodus actually start? God comes to Moses, and what does he say? What is in your hand? Oh, a rod. It's just a rod. But what happens when he throws the rod down? And you see what I'm saying? Where did God start? Oh, he's been doing this for 40 years. And you stop and think, what is going to be in your hand this week that you can use to serve for God? And these two wonderful echoes are going to go through chapter 7 and 8. The hand of the Lord was upon them, the blessing, the providence of God. And then over and over, something's going to be put in their hands. I just specifically remember when our kids were little. There's hardly few thrills in life that are any greater than just holding a little one, especially if they choose to actually hold you as well. And you stop and think, what's in your hand? And over through this section, the hand of God is going to be with them, and then God is providentially going to place things into their hands that then they are going to be responsible for using themselves. So if you notice, and I'm down in verse 17, offer these things, and there's a whole group of sacrifices. The king is not a monotheistic, only believing in Jehovah, but they're going to do this with several nations, and Israel's going to be a part of this. Go home, worship the God of Israel, he will refer to him. So here's a second decree in verse 21. Whatever Ezra, the priest, the scribe of the God of heaven requires, let it be done. And then here it is, Ezra, verse 25, according to the wisdom of your God. And where is this wisdom? That's in your hand. And you see how those two things dovetail and play together through this section especially. You're to go back and to the people, and it's called the people beyond the river. And again, we're down in the Tigris Euphrates, we're down in the kingdom of Persia, and they're going to come all the way up. And so for those people who live beyond the river in Judea, then go back and help them to know the Lord, and then those who do not know it, teach them. We've looked earlier at this term, steadfast love, and it's a term of covenant, it's a term of commitment, it's a term of loyalty. And this is something that's God's relationship with man. And according to the steadfast love of the Lord before the king, and the hand of the Lord was with me. So when you look at the bottom here at number 3, the first group of people get together and they're going to camp for 3 days. And Ezra's going to look at the people, and as he does, there are very few priests and Levites in this particular group. And so when you look at the next page, and this is going to be chapter 8, verse 18, there it is. The good hand of the Lord was upon us, and they brought us a man of discretion or insight. So you stop and think. If you're gathering together 2,000 people to travel over 900 miles over 4 months, wouldn't it be nice to have 1 or 2 people with some discretion and insight with you to get this? What would we be? It's not a cattle drive, it's not a herd, but this mass of people, and go all of this distance, and in the process, you remember how Moses starts stumbling and I can't do this, and on, and God basically says, don't worry, I'm going to send who? Aaron. And Aaron's going to help you. And so while Ezra's getting ready to make this enormous 4-month journey back, then they brought us a man of discretion or insight. And I love this passage. If you don't know this one, this was in 1 Chronicles 12:32. These are the men of Issachar. They understood the times to know what Israel ought to do. And that's a whole different context, but this is what God provides, and this is part of the hand of God, is that while they're getting ready to get this group of people together, God sends him a kind of like a right-hand man, someone who has a great sense of discretion. So think about this for a second, and I had never thought about this until this week. The things that belonged to the temple were only to be handled by the priests and the Levites. And Artaxerxes is going to be sending items from the temple, and Ezra looks around, and there's hardly any priests or Levites. So I'll use the word recruit. They recruit some more, and you'll read through this. They're going to weigh out gold. They're going to weigh out vessels. And who are the couriers? Who are the people who carry it? Priests and Levites. Because they were the ones that were designated under the law of Moses to take care of the things with the worship of God. And so while, no, they're not in the temple, they're 900 miles away, then he says, let's find some more of these priests and Levites, and they very carefully weigh out the things that the king sent back with them. And where does it come? Oh, he weighed that into their hand. And you see how that just flows together. They put these things in their hands, and they're to help carry them back to Israel. Verse 31, the hand of our God was on us. He delivered us from our enemy. We weighed into the hands of the priest all the things that took place. And I didn't read this tonight, but I just want to mention this in passing. They stop and they fast and pray because Ezra's embarrassed to ask for military transport because he's told the king, our God is going to look after us. And he is. And we're going to find later Nehemiah is going to come with an armed guard. But you think, how vulnerable are 2,000 people on foot traveling 900 miles for 4 months? With gold and silver and all this other stuff. So I can see why, if we're too embarrassed to ask the king for military help, at least we need to stop and fast and pray and give this a lot of thought and ask the God of heaven to be with us. And just, I'm sorry, in our culture we know wagon trains headed west. And one of my favorite stories about the wagon master is that he would get the ladies together and say, go back in your wagon and mark everything you're willing to die for. Because getting from the prairie across the Rocky Mountains to Oregon, all kinds of antiques, grandma's furniture, and other stuff was eventually thrown out by the time they got to the hill. But they would say, you go mark everything in your wagon you're willing to die for before we start out. And so you think, some people are going to bring too much, some people aren't going to bring enough. How do you feed 2,000 people for 4 months? And just look at all the logistics of the problems that are there. But they make the journey, they're safely there. And when they get back to Jerusalem, once they kind of catch their breath, what's the first thing they do? They weigh the silver and the gold and the items back, and those things are going to be preserved to be used in the temple. So we've talked about this, but notice the first one, the hand of the Lord. And this is a lovely idiom, and it's a striking expression of God's favor, and it's God's providence in looking after his people. And so here is a second group of exiles who are going to return to Jerusalem. But as I said, the other side is things were placed into people's hands. This was their responsibility. They were to be a part of and have a commitment to fulfill the purposes of God. But look at this term. This is Ezra. He set his heart. We're going to do this once more, and we're going to actually close with this. Some of the other translation says he devoted himself. He dedicated himself. He determined in his heart. One of my close friends used to say, luck is when preparation meets opportunity. And he wasn't one of those sit down and pat your foot and think of luck. Luck is when preparation meets opportunity. Bless her heart. My great-grandmother came to Indian Territory in 1901, 18 years of age, 3 little boys. She had 3 other children. And probably the last 30 years of her life, having raised her family and everything else, and her husband had died, hours every day, she didn't just read, she memorized the good book. And other than Hugo McCord and Johnny Ramsey, I would go at 10 on Sunday afternoon, and she would quote entire books of the Bible, look at me right in the eye, and turn the page. And it was just one of those things, she just devoted herself to that. Now, none of us have to work at that level, but fits in with our More Than Sunday. One of the things that all of us can do is to set aside time where we focus on, it may be smaller parts or other things, but this is where Ezra is such a good example. The things that God was able to use him to do later were the result of his devotion, dedication, and determination. And I read this little expression. He said, Ezra's dedication to preparation was the compass that charted the desire and the direction to prepare himself. But here's something, I've really enjoyed doing this. Where did he start? He started with his heart. And while all of these other things are going to be important, the actual focus had to do with his heart. And remember the proverb, I'm thinking it's 4:23, yeah. Above all else, guard your heart, for from it flow the issues of life. And so long before he stands up to teach, Ezra has been working on his heart as he reads and seeks to live and to do the will and the Word of God. And this is where these things, and I use the word synergy, they're going to tie together. His preparation is going to involve the things that he learned with the things that he would do. And both of these things work together. My younger brother Kent, and we've just done a lot of different things together, but we've been in situations, and Kent would just quietly say to a class, "You can't teach something you don't know." And in our upstairs in our house, we had a sense of Growler encyclopedias, probably from 1964. Larry, what is a set of 1964 encyclopedias worth today? Nothing. I mean, it's the entire set. And this is why I always told our kids, every minute that you spend with God's Word is yours forever. Not going to be updated, not going to go out of date, not going to be a new, revised version. And the other thing, too, my great-grandmother was 75 when I was born. At 85, because of her life experience, parts of God's Word are going to speak to her that they couldn't speak to me while I was 10 years old. And as we walk through life and as we have experiences, we're going to hear in different ways parts of God's Word because of that. So he's in a foreign land when all this happens. And think about that. Here he is, far away, 900 miles away, in exile, and he starts investigating God's statutes and rules. And I use the term from Jesus. He decided, I'm going to try to live what I teach. And one of our teachers encouraged us. He said, I'd love for you guys to study a book for a year and never teach from it. But just walk with it, just read it. And when we moved to Australia, I actually did that with Titus for 2 years. And hardly taught from it, but just nearly every day read something about it. And why do you do that? So it becomes a part of you rather than just something that you have thought about. And then the important part of teaching. There's a middle section I'll leave here for you to read most of it, but this is very important. Because he is a priest, the priests are the ones that God called from the time of Leviticus 10 all the way through Malachi to be the teachers of Israel. Prophets are important, and I listed probably 15 or 16 verses in the middle. But notice this, God called the priest to teach the law, teach the people all the statutes. And you'll just see this over and over and again, and this could have been an entire lesson, and I just listed samples. But here's what's important. Occasionally today, I'll hear someone use Deborah in the Old Testament or kind of an example off the side. Oh, God wanted women to teach and preach. Well, all of the teachers who are called, like I said, from Leviticus all the way through Malachi to teach are priests, and guess what? All the priests are men. And I say this kindly, and I'm not trying to raise a fuss, but when I talk with people who are feeling like, well, you're just following tradition and we're being more current and et cetera, I just ask them, how many women apostles did Jesus appoint? We all are going to have very specific roles in very specific places, but it's very interesting when you follow all the way through Scripture, so it's not just the Old Testament, all the way through the New, then that principle is the same. Here's two things that we're starting to close, but think about this, and we've touched on this before. Do you remember Joseph is at the beginning of the Old Testament? He's in Egypt, and what does he say to Potiphar's wife? How can I sin against God and commit this iniquity? He had made a commitment, a decision in terms of his moral life as a young man, and he was guided by that. You come to Daniel, who's going to be in northern captivity. He's going to be in Babylon. And in Daniel 10 and 12, a wonderful verse. It sounds like Ezra. Daniel, from the first day you set your heart to understand and you humbled yourself before God, your words have been heard. And I like the word either parentheses or opening. The opening section of Scripture, God preserves his people by a young man, Joseph. You meant this for harm, but God meant it for good. And God preserved his people through his moral and spiritual commitment. The very end of the Old Testament, we have Daniel. God's going to give Daniel the vision of the statue with all the different parts. That's going to be his last message for 400 years in terms of what's going to happen. And both of these young men are very similar to Ezra. And Ezra's story is the story of opportunity. Let me say it the other way. Preparation that was met by opportunity. There was a commitment to study, to know, but to do. And then once he had studied and thought about it, and then once he had been living it, then the blending of those two things then resulted and remained a part of his teaching. And so for each of us, to me, this is one of the clearest examples in all Scripture. How do we teach effectively in the circle where we are? And it's very specific. Ezra set his heart. He made a commitment to study the law of the Lord, to do it, and to teach its statutes and its commandments to Israel. And I would suggest that that's one of the best possible examples that we can have, because people will be reading us like a book. And sometimes I wonder, what is the gospel according to you?